Senator Rand Paul, so great to have you today here on the Cain Podcast. You've got a new book out, Deception, the Great COVID Cover-Up. At times, it reads like a spy thriller. At other times, it's making the case for what went down throughout what we all know of as the COVID pandemic for several years, a TikTok of what went down. You know, for anyone that's not trapped in the CNN or MSNBC, I would say, or even New York Times, at times, information bubble, they're somewhat well aware of the deception that has taken place when it comes to COVID. So anyone that reads Deception, what do you think would be the biggest surprise they would learn throughout this story in your book?
I think how extensive the cover-up is, that it's not just Anthony Fauci and a few scientists, that it really reaches into every nook and cranny of government. We think at least 8 different departments of government were involved with funding the research in Wuhan. And so the cover-up involves hundreds of people, and is in essence the conspiracy does. And people say, well, how could that happen? Where hundreds of people all got together, evil people in a room, and rubbed their hands together? It's not really that kind of conspiracy. And the comedian George Carlin put it well. He said that a conspiracy or a conspiracy theory is not necessary where interests converge. The interest is they all funded research in Wuhan, and now they're all scurrying to cover it up. So what we've found is resistance from an extensive array of officials throughout our government who don't want to release any information that connects them to funding of this dangerous research in Wuhan.
Yeah, Senator, and the interesting thing is there, as you lay it out, and it plays to the human instinct that, you know, people aren't necessarily capable of vast conspiracy, largely because what's more common than masterminds is incompetence. So it's hard for everyone to get on the same page to pull off that level of deception. But if interests converge, you can get everybody sort of pulling in the same direction. But your book only covers, in part, the Wuhan laboratory cover-up. You also talk about, you know, the efficacy of masks. You talk about school shutdowns, the necessity for vaccines in children, the efficacy of the vaccines at large. I'm curious, as you know, what was the motivational factor that continued the deception on, that it metastasized from covering up how it started, but it continued on into keeping the public in the dark about all these other aspects of COVID?
I would say for the idea that the virus leaked from the lab, the cover-up is the idea that you would be responsible basically for the pandemic, that the deaths, the millions of people who died, you would bear some responsibility, Anthony Fauci and those who approved of the money. For the rest of it, for the idea of the lockdowns and the schools and the centralization of the authority, that to me I think is consistent with the philosophy of elitism. That is that we should hire government experts, the experts in all different conditions. They would be in Washington, and that the people are too stupid to take care of themselves, that Americans can't make wise decisions, and so they should be made for them. And if you look at the discussions, particularly back and forth between Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci, you actually have them saying the quiet part out loud many times. They will say, well, this wouldn't be good for science, and I'm not sure the people would be ready to understand, and they might get too many masks if we tell them that only the N95 mask works, so we're going to tell them all the masks work. But many of these lies, I think, actually cost lives. So, for example, if your mother or grandmother was 75 years old and her husband had COVID and she's taking food into him but wants to protect herself, if she puts a cut-up piece of a T-shirt over her face, it isn't any protection at all. It's zero. So Fauci, by parading around in a mask with Washington Nationals on it that was made of cotton, he's not only giving bad advice, he's giving advice that could kill you. Because if you're really trying to protect yourself in a difficult situation, you don't wear a cloth mask because they just don't work, frankly. And so I begrudge him that. There was also a year when we had no vaccine. There was no way to prevent getting this or getting very sick. During that period of time, if we had acknowledged natural immunity, what a good public official would have done is said, let's have the nurses in the nursing home be people who have already recovered. As soon as people recover, let's put them in the COVID wing. Let's keep the disease together, but let's keep someone taking care of them that goes in and out and goes home that can't bring the disease back into the hospital. Ultimately, you would want this in all the nursing homes, someone to protect. In fact, I told this to Trump's security detail, and they didn't listen to me. I called Secret Service and I said, put the young men and women around him who've already had COVID. They'll block him from getting it, at least from them. But people discounted natural immunity. And because of this, I think lives were lost. But it was because we centralized the authority and we just said, whatever Lord Fauci told us, we were going to believe without questioning it. And that was a big mistake.
You know, I appreciate the philosophical nature of your answer, and I in no way disagree with it, that it's an ideology or philosophy of elitism. And then you centralize decision-making. But when you centralize decision-making, you also allow for a more easily accessible corruption. There's fewer people, fewer entities, fewer agencies that you have to reach. And when I look at everything you laid out, and I neglected to mention as well natural immunity, I'm glad you brought that up, as you laid out the sequence of deceptions throughout the pandemic, it's hard not to consider the role of money. It's hard not to consider the role of the pharmaceutical industry. And so while I appreciate you talking about the ideology of elitism, I wonder, what do you think was the role of money?
Well, there are several instances where we do bring this up and we do discuss this. For example, Christian Anderson was one of the lieutenants, one of the virologists around giving advice in the early days to Anthony Fauci. In private, he said that he believed that the virus had been manipulated and that the evidence pointed towards it coming from the lab. He indeed also said explicitly, this is not a fringe theory. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the most likely theory. 3 days later, at the behest of Anthony Fauci, he becomes the lead author on a paper that says you're crazy if you think it came from the lab and that it is absolutely without question not a construct of a lab. 2 months later, he gets a $9 million grant signed by Anthony Fauci. So there is money changing hands, billions of dollars. So when Anthony Fauci says, if you criticize him, you are criticizing science, that's the most absurd, arrogant thing I've ever heard from someone pretending to be a scientist. But really what you're questioning when you question him is the business of science.
Right.
The billions of dollars changing hand. And I'll give you one more quick example. The vaccine committees. I want to know if any scientists got royalties from the manufacturers of the vaccine and they were on the committee determining whether we should be forced to take these vaccines. They won't tell us. The fact that we won't tell us makes me think they have something to hide. And one of the reforms that I'm going to come forward with out of the research for this book is that we have to make it transparent. Every scientist is going to have to reveal their royalties. I'm trying to get Democrats interested in this. I think ultimately I'm going to win this battle, but I'm going to make sure that every scientist, their royalties have to be revealed to the public.
Well, you know, I like the term that you use there, the business of science, and it's if we explore the role of money in the business of science, you can see its effect. You can see its effect in the advertising support, in the foundational support of science magazines that were on the wrong side of this from the very beginning. You can see it in the public officials and funding and granting research, and you can see it obviously in the role it played in vaccine mandates and undercutting anything that would prove to be an alternative to the vaccine, from hydroxychloroquine. There's a debate over the efficacy of ivermectin, but that debate was kind of strangled in the crib. It was never truly seen the light of day. And so, when I bring up money, it doesn't take a ton of cynicism, and I think it takes zero partisanship to say what the common thread here that ties natural immunity to the Wuhan virus Institute of Virology is the role of big science and money and the pharmaceutical industry.
Well, after I was infected early on in the disease, I came back and I wasn't wearing a mask, and all the reporters would run up to me, these 23-year-old reporters with 3 masks who've never had a science course in any kind of educational setting. And they're like, why aren't you wearing a mask? And I said, well, I have immunity now. I've been infected. Like, no, you don't. You don't know how long you'll have it and this and that. But we had this whole sort of overwhelming idea that natural immunity didn't work. There was a Harvard professor by the name of Martin Kulldorff, and he had a great response to this. He said, we learned about immunity in 486 BC during the Athenian plague, and we knew about it until 3 years ago. And then we forgot about it for 3 years, and now we're starting to learn about natural immunity again. But natural immunity is free. And when I would tell people about it and the protective effects, they would say, oh, you just want everybody to get infected. If they don't die, then they have immunity. It's like, how insulting. What I'm saying is a lot of people got infected whether they're vaccinated or not. Tell them the truth. There still is one big truth they haven't told us. Most people over 65 got vaccinated. So let's say I got 2 vaccines and I've had COVID twice. What are the chances if I do nothing else, what are the chances I go to the hospital or I die from COVID? They know the answer to that. I suspect it's very close to 0 unless you're very ill for another reason. So we could probably tell those who are at risk over 65, they don't need any more vaccines. But why aren't they telling us that? They're just saying, oh, there's a new one. There'll be a new one every 3 months. Keep taking it. And it makes me think they're salesmen for Big Pharma instead of scientists. And it makes me disbelieve them. And they're the ones that are causing this whole hesitancy and this idea that nobody believes in government. It's because they're not being honest or forthright with us.
I want to save some time for you and I to talk about foreign policy today before you have to head to the floor and take a vote. But a few more questions on deception. I've read the book, and I know the rough outlines of the theories that lead us toward the truth. In the end, what happened? Was it that the NIH, through EcoHealth Alliance, was helping fund gain-of-function research around American law, subverting American law, outsourcing it to Chinese laboratories? And in your estimation, in pursuit of what, Senator Paul? In pursuit of a prophylactic vaccine? In pursuit of a weapon that the Chinese were subverting? What was the point of all of this? What's the truth?
I think we don't know for sure, and we can't say for certain that it was for vaccine development or for weapon development. It argues against it being a weapon development to release a weapon in your own country. It just doesn't seem to make sense, unless it was an accident. They were working on a weapon and it accidentally got released. With the vaccine, we have a great deal of information that a fellow by the name of General Zhou Yushin, who's in the People's Liberation Army, a prominent communist and a scientist, he has a vaccine developed already in February 2020. Most scientists look at it and say it takes about 4 or 5 months, a minimum, to get this vaccine moving, so they had to know in November. We also know in November, 3 scientists in Dr. Xi's lab got sick with a pneumonia of unknown origin with ground glass opacities in the X-ray consistent with COVID. We also know that Zhou Yushin, the general who develops the vaccine, who gets it so early, in April of 2020 is dead. He either falls or is pushed from a tall building. We don't know the circumstances of that, whether it was suicide or it was intentional, that someone pushed him, but it's very, very suspicious. The best theory I have is that Zhou Yushin commissioned and worked with Dr. Xi, the bat scientist, to create a very virulent, a more significant coronavirus that infected humans. So they added in that cleavage site, the furin cleavage site, to make it enter into the cells better. But then when they were working on it, either attenuating it to make it a vaccine or doing something in the lab, people in the lab got sick in November 2019. And the way a pandemic works is that you don't go from 0 to millions, it's got to ratchet up. It does it exponentially, but throughout November and December, it's doing this. And they knew it. We have pictures of parking lots full of patients. We have the Wuhan Institute with no cell phone traffic for a week when we think they're trying to clean up the lab after the outbreak. But by January, when it hits, it's going like crazy. And still, the Chinese government says, oh, we don't think it's transmitted human to human. They were absolutely lying from the beginning.
And what do you think, and finally last on this, what accountability do you expect? What should happen with Dr. Anthony Fauci for this deception?
He lied to Congress. That's a felony. If he had been a Trump official, he'd have been in jail long ago. I've referred him for prosecution, and Merrick Garland has responded saying he got our letter, but there's been no investigation that we know of. We know he lied, not because I say so, but because his private emails contradict his public statements, and they show that he was lying. Without question, we have him dead to rights. In his own words, he was lying and nothing will be done. To me, culpability is important, but I don't have control. I can't prosecute. People are all the time, why don't you prosecute? I'm not the prosecution. I can't do it. But the other thing I want to have happen is I want this type of research that we're paying for through our tax dollars to be circumscribed, to be regulated, to have a real committee of scientists looking at what is worthwhile, what is not worthwhile, and not just saying, hey, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we took Ebola and see if we get, which is 50% deadly, and see if we can make it aerosolized? That's a death wish. So I'm not giving up on this until we either get culpability and or new law that says we can't do this research without more oversight.
All right, Senator, you have an independent voice, a very, very independent voice in Washington, D.C. when it comes to our foreign policy, pretty much our bipartisan foreign policy posture across the globe. I want to start with Ukraine. Ukraine funding has been a never-ending spigot out of Washington, D.C. What do you think should be the perspective or the role of the United States in whatever is supposed to happen there in Eastern Europe between Ukraine and Russia? What should be the position of the United States?
You know, people describe us as a great power, as a world power, as a superpower. I think it would be trying to end the war. I don't think it's possible that Ukraine can defeat Russia, nor do I think it's possible now that Russia can defeat Ukraine. The commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army recently, as this week, said he thinks it's a stalemate. When you get to a stalemate, somebody should be looking for an off-ramp. Graham Allison is a Harvard professor who's written several books on foreign policy, and I really respect his views. He said that there is a danger that escalation, when you trap someone, when you corner someone, if Putin feels like there's no way out, he's either going to be deposed or have to admit to a terrible loss, that the reaction could be an escalation to nuclear war, even if he thinks he can get away with limited nuclear war. But one atomic bomb killing 100,000 people is a horrific thing, and then there's a danger that either we or some in Europe respond. I think we should try to avoid that. I think there is a way to avoid that, and one of the answers is maybe a ceasefire in place with Ukraine saying, you're in our property and want you out, and we're not going to accept that you have part of eastern Ukraine or Crimea, but we're now going to negotiate. With Russia saying, can't move us, we're not leaving, but we're not going any further, and we're not going to be bombing your cities. And then the talks would begin. I think that's what we should be asking for, but we have people in Congress, particularly in my caucus, who believe in this sort of first-grade understanding of foreign policy that war ends in unconditional surrender. That rarely happens. It happened after Japan, after 2 atomic weapons, we had unconditional surrender. Germany was utterly defeated. But I would say the vast majority of wars, there's not a complete victory and they have to be negotiated. I think that's what we should use our leadership role, is to try to bring peace, because look, even if your only goal is to preserve what's left of Ukraine and its people, you should want peace, because the country is being bombed into oblivion and it's a disaster. And so I think peace is what we should look for, and there could be a negotiated settlement. Yeah,
and I saw that you wrote that on one of the rare occasions where you might agree with Henry Kissinger, that compromise could look something like Ukraine can trade and join economic alliances with whoever it wants, elect the government that it wants, but it won't be invited into NATO, was sort of the outline of something you described. But because we only have a few more minutes together, I want to ask you the same question. What should be the American perspective? What should we do? What position should we take when it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to Israel and its current war with Hamas?
I think the first thing to acknowledge is Israel is in a perilous position. They've been there a long time. The neighbors around them are hostile, and that you can't allow or condone people to come into your country and kill hundreds of people at a music festival. You can't condone or allow people to come in and just kill entire families within their villages and their homes. And so I think Israel has to be allowed to make their own decisions on it. We do give them a lot of money. We give them a lot of weapons. It gives us the right to have an opinion, but ultimately they're going to have to make some of their decisions. And ultimately there will be a decision made. The thing is Hamas wants to kill, their goal was to kill civilians, and they did, and women and children. Israel's goal isn't to do that, but it is an inadvertent part of the response, is that women and children are dying. And so there is a point at which Israel will have to make a decision. Are we creating more terrorists than we kill? And this has been a decision around the world. You know, if we drone some goat herder in Mali, did we get rid of terrorism, or will all of his kinfolk now become terrorists and hate America? So there is a point. And I'm not saying Israel isn't justified. Israel's justified in responding. They should try to wipe out Hamas. But I'm a believer that at some point, people in Israel and the United States should be saying, you know what? If Gaza would have leadership that would recognize Israel and renounce violence, we could help assist in a port making. There's many rich Gulf sheikhdoms. We could allow them to come in and make a port. There might have to be Israeli security at the port, but allow Gaza to become a trading port and allow economic wealth to come in. Most of the people there don't believe Israel would allow that. That's why I think people need to say it over and over again. If they renounce violence, if they recognize Israel, there could be great prosperity for a city that lives in utter poverty. But we're a long way from getting the people in Gaza to believe that. That's why I think it needs to be spoken over and over again by Israel primarily, but also the United States.
Well, I'm concerned, and as you lay out that, which does sound, in your own acknowledgement, somewhat not far-fetched, but maybe starry-eyed, that type of ending to this story. I think that I'm concerned of something that seems less far-fetched or starry-eyed, which is American involvement. How concerned are you with the potential for American involvement, either because proxies like Iran begin to get more overtly and undeniably involved, but how concerned are you about America in the Middle East?
Very much. I mean, this goes back to 1983 and the bombing of the Beirut, the Marine barracks there. There's always a danger, a tragedy like that brings us into a war. Reagan made a difficult decision. He was criticized by many of the neoconservatives. He said it's too messy and we're just not staying. We have 900 troops in Syria. That's a ridiculously small number of people to have in the middle of a war zone. What are they? They're a target for Iranian proxies, and they're a tripwire to getting us in. So I argued 2 weeks ago on the Senate floor that we shouldn't be in Niger. They've had a coup, and there's an illegitimate government with a democratically elected president in jail. We should not have troops there now that there's been a coup. I would argue the same thing in Syria. That is a war. But my opponents will say, oh, it's not a war in Syria. Well, they're shooting at each other all the time. It's essentially a long, smoldering civil war now in Syria. We never voted to put them in there. So I'll force a vote on this again. With the Niger War Powers Resolution, I only got 11 votes. So the vast majority of people just don't care. But I care because I know young members of the military, and I don't want them sent into the Middle East because we had a barracks bombed in Syria or in Iraq or in Niger or any of these far-flung places. Bottom line for me is it has to be a vote, and it's the most difficult vote any legislator ever makes, and it should be whether to go to war. But we're at war in all of these places, and our troops are there based on the 9/11 authorization to use force, which has nothing to do with the world as we see it today. And I think it's our obligation now, not to say a generation ago those people voted for that. We should have to vote now, vote up or down. And I will force them to vote up or down on whether we're in Syria, and we will continue. And it is my hope that we are not sending soldiers into Israel or Gaza, and I don't think there's any military reason we should.
What a legacy if you're able to accomplish those two things, holding Dr. Anthony Fauci accountable and returning America to having congressional declarations of war. That would be one hell of a legacy, Senator. I know you have a floor vote. I really appreciate your time, Senator Rand Paul.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.